Take up the white man's burden, send forth the best ye breed. Go bind your sons to exile, to serve your captives' need, to wait in heavy harness on fluttered folk and wild, your new caught sullen people, half devil and half child. The white man's burden is a European philosophical concept that dates back over a century before Rudyard Kipling penned the idea down in his 1899 poem, The White Man's Burden. Now, the basic idea behind this concept is that it is the moral and civilizational duty of white European people in order to go across the world civilizing the uncivilized and bringing enlightenment to the unenlightened masses of non-European people who, unlike Europeans, were savage, barbarous, and in need of European salvation. Such an idea was used by colonizers and imperialists in order to manufacture consent among the European masses, in order to gain the support of the people in Europe for their foreign adventures. Because what better way to justify colonial land theft, looting, and plunder if you put it under the guise of social justice? If you somehow can convince the people of your country that these non-European nations that you're plundering from are inherently vile, savage, and backward, and the reason you're going to these countries is not because you want land or spices, or diamonds, or rubber, or tin, or timber, or copper, or pewter, but simply because you want to help the natives. You're not going there because of your own colonial rapaciousness or your own need to satisfy the demands under capitalism for more resources. No, you're going there because it's for the natives' own good. So a few years ago, I made this video lecture entitled, What is Orientalism? Which is basically a short introduction to the concept of Orientalism, which is a theory that was put forward by the Palestinian-American philosopher Edward Said. Now, I invite you to check out this video, but basically, in a very, very, very small nutshell, Orientalism is basically seeing the East through Occidental lens, or a Western lens, right? Now, one way you could look at Orientalism is basically when a Westerner comes to an Eastern country, like in Asia or the Middle East, and they find customs which they are unusual to their Western sensibilities, right? For example, if they find that adult children live with their parents in Asian countries, this might seem very, very unusual to a Western mind, including an Asian American mind. Yeah, so when I say Westernized, I'm also counting people of color who were born and raised in Western countries. Now, a more benign form of Orientalism is when someone from a Western country comes to Asia and they view Asian cultural norms with a judgmental rather than a curious attitude. For example, they may ask people in Asia, you guys still live with your parents? Really? Seriously? You guys need to modernize. And that's a more benign or less odious form of Orientalism. It's basically seeing Eastern cultural lens as being inferior and backward compared to Western cultural norms, which are considered more progressive and enlightened, right? And basically, you don't have to be a white person to be an Orientalist. You could be an Asian American or an African American, but if you view non-Western cultures, namely Asian cultures, as being inferior to modern Western cultures, namely Anglo-Saxon cultures, well, you are also practicing Orientalism. Now, there's a more insidious type of Orientalism that Syed puts forward. And basically, the more insidious form of Orientalism is not only portraying the East as the polar opposite of the West, and not only portraying the East as strange, backwards, exotic, but at the same time bizarre, but also portraying the East as dangerous, basically portraying the East as a dangerous place full of sultry women and dangerous men. And this is what I intend to talk about in my video. The fact that Orientalism is not simply harmless rubbish. Orientalism, when taken to an extreme, can be deadly. When you read Western colonial literature written by Europeans about people in the East, you find a very unflattering picture being painted of the natives. The key word that we have to understand here is dehumanization. When you dehumanize an entire group of people by portraying them as being inherently wild, savage, and barbaric, what does that do? It basically causes people in the outgroup to gradually see them as being subhuman. And that is the danger of Orientalism, basically. Now, you could perhaps even look at the American settler colonials in the 1700s and 1800s in their dehumanization of Native Americans as inherently criminal, inherently dangerous, and inherently savage as a form of Orientalism as well, even though, strictly speaking, America is not located in the Orient. But nevertheless, the same kinds of arguments were put forward by the American settler colonials under the banner of Manifest Destiny, which basically stipulated that these Native Americans were killing each other because they were savage and lawless, and basically it took white Western European people in order to civilize them and introduce things like democracy, rule of law, and respect for women, even though Native Americans could not even vote in the 1700s, right? Native Americans were kept in reservations, right? And they were forcefully assimilated into European culture. But nevertheless, white Western settlers used the argument of civilization in order to justify their plunder and colonial land theft, right? As if Native Americans did not already have civilizations before the white European settlers. Westerners and Europeans in colonial times act as if the civilization of America only dates back to 1776, right? And before George Washington, there was apparently no such thing as civilization in the Americas. But let's go back to Mr. Rudyard Kipling for a moment, right? Let's go back to Kipling and read the last line of the first verse in his poem. Your new caught sullen peoples, new caught, talking about them as if they're animals, right? And not human beings. Half devil and half child. And that gives you an idea of just how insidious Orientalism really is. Portraying the natives as dangerous and evil, but at the same time too stupid and ignorant to know what's best for their own good. So you need a wise and enlightened European man in order to take over their regions and basically enforce good, proper European values. Now you might have heard of the acronym PEP, which basically means Progressive Except for Palestine. And this is an acronym which, in my opinion, really accurately describes many white American liberals who are selectively progressive based on people they feel that they can identify with. For example, of course they will say that gay people and women should be treated equally. Of course they will tell you that Black Lives Matter, as long as those black lives are of people who agree with them. And of course they will tell you that, apartheid is a thing of the past. It is an awful thing that should never ever happen again. Even though there are still Native Americans living in reservations, right? But these very same white American liberals will show you their true colors when it concerns the topic of Israel and Palestine. Because when you mention the word Palestinians, you will find that these supposedly enlightened and progressive white liberals will then start talking exactly the way their settler colonial ancestors used to talk about people from the Orient. They will talk about Palestinians as if they were violent, unreasonable, and barbarous anti-Semitic terrorists. And Israel apparently has no other choice but to occupy them and kill them.
I mean, I see the Palestinian argument. They have a legitimate gripe. What I don't see is the argument from so much of the rest of the world that they also have the moral high ground. I see on the news every night lots of reports, and it's very sad, we all feel horrible about them, of Palestinian civilians who are dying, including children. Nobody seems to ask, whose fault is that mostly? I feel terrible for a Palestinian child who dies, but if it's your father, your brother, your uncle who is firing those rockets into Israel, whose fault is it really? Do you really expect the Israelis not to retaliate?
There's a saying in America, scratch a liberal and a fascist bleeds, right? Now, basically what that means is that liberals and fascists actually have more in common with each other than they'd care to admit. The only difference is that, well, the fascist is openly contemptuous about women's rights and of gay rights, while the liberal hides his own racism, xenophobia, and bigotry behind the mask of woke language. While the fascist will tell you that this group of people need to be killed or need to be subjugated because they are inherently inferior, the liberal will tell you that this group of people need to be subjugated and oppressed because they themselves are vile, barbarous, and evil. Look no further than the example of America's favorite racist comedian, Bill Maher. And when I call him racist, this is by no stretch of the imagination a form of hyperbole, because Bill Maher is, in fact, a racist. There is no other way to put it.
Word. In Saudi Arabia, women cannot drive a car, sail a boat, fly a plane, which is why their tampon ads are just horseback riding.
But don't you think in the end people have a right to self-determination? Or you're saying that they shouldn't have... How does a continuation of strongman rule lead to better attitudes toward women?
Civilization begins with civilizing the men. The women are sort of already there. You have to bring along the men, and I know this is anecdotal, but talk to women who've ever dated an Arab man. The reviews are not good. They have a sense of entitlement. They will say, yes, we put women on a pedestal. As long as they're obedient, they're on the pedestal.
Every man I've ever dated has a sense of entitlement. I don't know.
Have you ever dated a Middle Eastern man? Okay.
All I'm saying respectfully is, and I don't disagree with the fact that they've got a long way to go. What I'm trying to suggest to you is that when we have these conversations about how they treat women, as if somehow we treat women better in this country.
We do.
It demonizes Muslim. It demonizes.
No, it's not demonizing. That's saying that I'm prejudiced. I'm saying I'm not prejudiced. That's prejudging. I'm not prejudging. I'm judging. I'm judging.
Can we all agree?
They're worse. What's wrong with just saying that? You're a cultural relativist. It's not relative. Yes, it is relative.
Are you Republicans?
No. I don't think there's any worse. I don't think there's a worse.
Notwithstanding the fact that Bill Maher has been Me Too'd for sexually harassing his female guests, or that American CEOs and politicians have also been Me Too'd by women who were abused by them and who dared not speak out for fear of being punished, their careers being ruined by these powerful men, or that there was an American president who openly boasted that if you're a powerful man in America, you can grab women by the P-U-S-S-Y, right? Bill Maher has the audacity to juxtapose men who are of Arabic descent with American, presumably white American men, as being basically savage, barbaric, and in need of civilization. This shit is basically white man burden 2.0, right? And it seems that Maher has tried really, really hard to erase this particular scene from our memory. That's why you can't find that episode of his Bill Maher show. I had to actually download an audio, but I couldn't find the episode, right? Yeah, but you see, people like me, who have been keeping track of people like Bill Maher for nearly 1.5 decades, right? We have a long memory, right? There are some young, impressionable, gullible young people who might follow Bill Maher, who don't know about Bill Maher's past, but people like myself have a long memory, Bill, and we know exactly what you said. But this is what we mean, basically, by portraying the native as savage and backward, but disguising it under the mask of social justice. In order to justify the colonization and imperialism that take place in the native's land, you first need to make him be seen as subhuman. Like, notice how he lumped in every single Arab man as the same and basically painted all of them under the same brush. That's exactly what we have seen with the yellow peril posters of the 19th century, right? Or the anti-Semitic posters of the hooked-nosed Jew in Europe. Yes, liberal American comedian, if I may call him a comedian, Bill Maher, said back in 2011, talk to women who've ever dated an Arab man. The reviews are not good. Civilization begins with civilizing the men. Now, many of Maher's defendants will say, no, Maher was only talking about Muslim men. Now, even if Maher was only talking about Muslim men, that would still have been repugnant, right? But there is quite a clear distinction between Arab and Muslim, because there are also Christian Arabs as well as atheist or Buddhist Arabs. And Maher was very, very clear in his terminology. He said Arab, not Muslim. Now, if Bill Maher was strictly saying that Muslim men were a bunch of vile, barbarous rapists with a sense of entitlement, that would still have been repugnant, but at least he would have had a case that he wasn't being a racist, right? However, he very, very clearly said Arab men, not Muslim men, right? Now, if we were talking about, a Japanese or a Chinese Muslim, I imagine Bill Maher was not thinking about a Japanese or a Chinese or a Norwegian Muslim when he said Arab men have a sense of entitlement. Because Maher, in all honesty, is an American propagandist. Yes, Bill Maher, who offered to be part of Benjamin Netanyahu's government once, is an American propagandist. And it is Maher's job, in order to paint people from the Arabic world as being inherently backward, uncivilized, and dangerous, in order to manufacture consent for the American empire's projects. And I also include Israel as part of the American empire, yeah? Because you see, Israel is a proxy of America. Because do you know how these American neoliberals like to juxtapose between Palestine and Israel using human rights, using their attitude towards LGBT people, as if every single Palestinian was a barbarous reactionary who wanted to kill gay people, right? They always use things like women's rights and gay rights in order to explain the inherent differences between Israeli people and people in Gaza and the occupied territories. By doing so, they basically manufacture consent by basically turning the European populations against the Palestinian people. Because if you can convince people in the Western world, and all around the world for that matter, that Palestinians are evil, barbarous, anti-Semitic, and cruel, well, there you go. Gradually, people around the world stop seeing them as humans, right? And if you do that successfully enough, people around the world will grow desensitized to what Israel does. Because Israel is apparently the bastion of liberalism, where women and LGBT people apparently enjoy far better rights than in places such as Gaza or the West Bank. And in fact, they enjoy such enormous human rights that, they even promote gay people and lesbian people to captain in the Israeli army. So, you can be a gay person and you can still have the honor of going in and killing Palestinian babies, right? That's the honor that Israel grants even to its LGBT citizens, right? So that's inherently what makes Israel better than the countries they brutalize, that deserve to be brutalized according to this narrative, because they are purportedly less socially progressive than Israel. And this is called pinkwashing, yeah? I've talked about it before.
Just want to finish with the values first, because it's just amazing to me that the American left, so much of it, throws their lot in with people whose values I hope they don't share, but let's go through them. Because values and customs make a difference, okay? And the people of Gaza, by the way, if the Israelis did get rid of Hamas, they'd be doing a giant favor to the people of Gaza who hate Hamas. But let's just go through the list. Because the Israelis look like us in most ways, values-wise. Maybe we're not doing it the right way. I don't know. Religious tolerance. That doesn't exist in Gaza. You're either Muslim or an infidel, and you better be a Muslim. Female freedom. Free and fair elections. Free speech. Gay rights. I see these Queers for Palestine.
Did you hear their sister organization, Blacks for the KKK?
It's like...
By the way, I'm a gay man. I've lived in Berlin. This is a level of masochism that even I cannot comprehend.
Right. I mean... Can I just finish my list of pedophilia? I'll put that under don't ask. Child brides and so forth. Equality of the sexes, I'll categorize that under don't make me fucking laugh. The fact that, these people think that this is where they should be aligned with, that these are the values that you support?
I think this past week has been a real important moment for a moral reckoning on the American left. Because there is a small, and I'm going to emphasize that, a very small, but growing and extremely loud faction on the American left that has revealed itself.
I don't know how to be anymore.
Okay, well, I don't mean...
It was all over.
Well, we just had a conversation about the algorithm, right? And I think you have a few groups, you have some college groups, you have some activist groups.
It's college.
Okay.
First of all, religious radicalization does not happen in a vacuum, yeah? Like, people do not become far right-wing fundamentalist religious people overnight, right? And these things occur, especially under harsh material conditions. And second of all, if we use the logic that certain groups are less socially progressive as a collective, and therefore deserve to be treated worse than socially progressive groups, even though individual members of the group will disagree on everything, right? Then by that logic, it is acceptable to go and rob and loot people's places or people's shops or people's property just because those people do not share our values, right? Yeah, that's the kind of logic that people like Bill Maher put out, right? But I find it very, very telling when he said that those people are not like us. Those people do not share our values. So why is the American left so dedicated to defending them, right? Who gives a rat's ass whether they share your values or not? I probably have nothing in common with the average Palestinian chap. I probably have more in common culturally with the average left-wing Israeli chap. But when it concerns human life, right, it doesn't matter whether the human life belongs to someone who agrees with me or disagrees with me, right? And people like Ma have exposed themselves as the fascists they really are, right? They have basically exposed their xenophobia and bigotry in its most raw, naked form. Finally, by admitting that those people, meaning the Palestinians, do not have anything in common with nice, civilized people like us, right? And by his logic, every Palestinian, including a Palestinian child, is the same as an evil anti-Semitic Nazi commando. A few days ago, a Palestinian 6-year-old boy was tragically stabbed to death by his landlord. And what makes it even more tragic is that his mother was not able to attend his funeral, because guess what? His mother is fighting for her life in hospital as well, right? Do you think that this landlord stabbed the boy and his mother because they were Muslim, as the American media is trying to portray in order to save face? Do you think if he were a Japanese Muslim or a Norwegian Muslim, he would have been stabbed to death? No. He was stabbed to death because he was an Arab. The landlord had probably imbibed enough anti-Arab Orientalist propaganda from the likes of Bill Maher and Sam Harris that he had grown desensitized to seeing these people as human beings. What that means is that landlord basically viewed those people as inherently dangerous and evil, including that 6-year-old child, right? Because Orientalism kills. Orientalism not only causes you to see people's culture as being backward and savage, no. If you listen enough to the likes of Bill Maher, you will eventually become extremely xenophobic, and you will basically view people from the Arab world who are ethnically Arab as being an inherent existential threat to the survival of the civilized world, right? I am not defending the actions of this landlord. They were repugnant, they were awful, but just like the case when that Eastern European guy went and killed the Chinese restaurant owner because he thought that Chinese men were cruel to women, right? As a result, probably, of reading the Joy Luck Club or watching the Joy Luck Club. Orientalist propaganda is so dangerous because it really dehumanizes groups, entire groups of people, in the eyes of otherwise normal people, right? Even Charles Dickens himself, supposedly a fighter for the underdog, was not above falling into the trap of Orientalism. In a letter to a friend of his, Dickens admitted that he would like to commit genocide on the Indian race. I wish I were Commander-in-Chief of India. The first thing I would do to strike that Oriental race with amazement should be to proclaim to them in their language that I considered my holding that appointment by the leave of God to mean that I should do my utmost to exterminate the race upon whom the stain of the late cruelties rested, and that I beg them to do me the favor to observe that I was there for that purpose and no other, and was now proceeding, with all convenient dispatch and merciful swiftness of execution, to blot it out of mankind, and raise it off the face of the earth. Yes, Charles Dickens, the supposed fighter for the underdog, right, was also a believer in British colonialism because he believed that it was for the good of the natives, that it was for their own good, because he had imbibed enough propaganda for that. But because he only heard one-sided Western reports from India, and he heard that Indians were barbarous, violent, and savage without ever having met an Indian person, Dickens eventually grew to hate the Indian race and regard them as a cancer in this world, right? And that is what Orientalism can do to you. Because Dickens probably would not have come to the conclusion that the Indian race was a cancer in the world if it had not been his surroundings, his material conditions, which led to that conclusion in the first place. A few years ago, I was talking to a Malaysian Chinese shitlip, right, who was basically arguing with me over the need for the continued occupation of Palestine, right? And I think this guy also was biased against the Palestinian cause because he regarded basically the Palestinian cause as a Melayu cause, right? Because lots of Malay reactionaries do support Palestine, but more so because they hate Jews rather than care about the Palestinians in the first place, right? But I asked him, do you think that every Palestinian, including a Palestinian child, is some anti-Semitic Nazi commando? And this was his answer. He said, well, considering that they voted for Hamas, they, meaning the Palestinians, voted for Hamas, every Palestinian ought to be treated with suspicion until proven otherwise, right? This is what Orientalism does. This is basically what happens when you imbibe enough Orientalist propaganda. And it's very, very, very difficult for us ever to call out the atrocities of Israel or to call for Palestine to be free from the river to the sea, because we are bound to get called anti-Semitic. Even though Palestinians are Semites themselves, we will always get called anti-Semitic and basically lumped in with Nazis if we should ever call for Palestine to be free from the river to the sea, right? And if we say that the Israeli occupation or Zionism itself is a Western philosophy, a European philosophy that has nothing to do with Judaism, we get called anti-Semitic all the same, right? But what if I told you that the first people to propose the concept of Zionism were European secular Jews like Theodor Herzl, whom I will explore further in a future video, right? Do you think Herzl, being part of the Austrian Jewish diaspora, had anything in common with native Jewish people in Baghdad or even in Palestine? No, because those people, the Zionists of the 19th century who wanted a Jewish ethno-state, themselves viewed the Jews back home as barbarous, old-fashioned and quaint, backward people. And they believed that, on one hand, while they were escaping from anti-Semitism and persecution from Europe, they were also bringing civilized Western values with them, right? Because like I said, you don't even need to be a white European person to be a Western chauvinist or an Orientalist. You read Herzl's book, his 1896 book, The Jewish State, right? And it is filled with racist, colonialist diatribes. And basically, I will show you a part from his book in which he basically admits that his so-called Jewish state, which came to be known as Israel, although he died before Israel was even founded, because Herzl died in 1904, before his vision for his Jewish ethno-state could be realized. This is what Herzl said, that his Jewish ethno-state would be basically a rampart for the West to guard against the barbarous East. Take a look.
Palestine is our ever memorable historic home. The very name of Palestine would attract our people with a force of marvelous potency. If His Majesty the Sultan were to give us Palestine, we could in return undertake to regulate the whole finances of Turkey. We should there form a portion of a rampart of Europe against Asia, an outpost of civilization as opposed to barbarism. We should as a neutral state remain in contact with all Europe, which would have to guarantee our existence. The sanctuaries of Christendom would be safeguarded by assigning to them an extraterritorial status such as well known to the law of nations. We should form a guard of honor about these sanctuaries, answering for the fulfillment of this duty with our existence. This guard of honor would be the great symbol of the solution of the Jewish question after 18 centuries of Jewish suffering.
It cannot be any clearer. The Zionists of the 19th century did not regard themselves as Oriental or Asian whatsoever. They regarded themselves first and foremost as a civilizing force in the Middle East. They regarded themselves as European culturally, right? So, there is a reason why Israel is not only the most westernized country in the Middle East, there's a reason why white Western racists who would feel uncomfortable in any other Middle Eastern country would feel quite at home in Israel. And there's a reason why even some of the worst anti-Semites, like Arthur Balfour, who signed the Balfour Declaration, also supported this so-called Jewish state. Because the nation-state of Israel would fundamentally promote Western, not Jewish values, modern European values, first of all, right? Second of all, it would serve as a proxy for the West to guard against the rising Orient, right? And third of all, the migration of Jewish people out of Europe would also be beneficial, or in the eyes of these anti-Semites, because these anti-Semites basically viewed Zionism not with contempt, but with relief, actually, because basically, even though Palestine was already occupied by inhabitants who had lived there for centuries, right? Who would come to be known as the Palestinians, right? The anti-Semites in Europe didn't care. Because if these Zio-Saxons, let's call them Zio-Saxons, would go and take over, basically, well, the anti-Semites like Balfour and even Churchill just saw it as a course of natural selection, that basically more worldly wise, enlightened, and superior westernized Jews, just like what happened in Liberia, would take over and serve as their proxies in the Middle East, right? You see, Herzl was not only a secular Jewish person. Herzl was a social Darwinist, right? And what's more, Herzl even saw anti-Semitism as the impetus that would help him to realize the creation of his Jewish nation-state, right? Herzl might not have approved of anti-Semitism, but he certainly saw the anti-Semites as strange bedfellows, as ironic friends in the creation of his nation-state, because Herzl believed that anti-Semites would even help facilitate the creation of this nation-state by making life so unbearable for Jewish people in Europe that they would thus go along with his colonial project. So use this line whenever somebody wants to accuse you of being anti-Semitic because you say you stand against the nation-state of Israel. Tell them that their founding father, their spiritual founding father, had no problem working together with anti-Semites, right? And he viewed, well, Jews as who basically did not fight back against anti-Semites as well, weaklings who deserved to be kicked and bullied, right?
Our oppression and persecution cannot exterminate us. No nation on earth has survived such struggles and suffering as we have gone through. Jew baiting has merely stripped us of our girly men. The strong among us were invariably true to their race when persecution broke out against them. This attitude was most clearly apparent in the period immediately following the emancipation of the Jews.
But I'm sure you've seen that despite the fact that Russians and Ukrainians are almost 100% identical genetically, when Ukraine, which is the proxy of the West, went to war with Russia, well, what the Western media did was they basically portrayed the Russians as being more Oriental, more savage, so to speak, right? And they portrayed the Ukrainians as being more European, basically, even though they are almost 100% genetically identical. There's a reason for this, right? It's because, basically, Orientalism is meant to dehumanize a certain group in order to manufacture consent for violence or oppression or subjugation of that particular group, right? If men can make you believe absurdities, they can make you commit atrocities. So said Voltaire. I'm sure you've seen also, 19th century American comics or American posters, propaganda posters portraying Chinese men as hyper-masculine, barbaric, and dangerous, right? The so-called yellow peril. So how did the Chinese man evolve from being the yellow peril to the model minority? Well, that's because China had already been defanged and declawed by the time the Chinese man became the model minority. And it's only a certain type of Chinese man that gets called a model minority, right? A bourgeois, westernized Chinese man who basically parrots the correct script that the colonizers want him to parrot. I don't think Chin Peng, the Malaysian communist leader, would ever be called a model minority by these colonizers, would he? But my point still stands, you see. It's when you want to manufacture consent, that's when you start the dehumanization process, and you start this insidious process of basically portraying an entire group of people, an entire race or ethnicity of people as being less than human. And if you can do it well enough, eventually the common people of your country will regard even an innocent little Palestinian child in the same way they would regard a Nazi commando. Yes, that is just how dangerous Orientalism is. If you want Israel and Palestine to be at peace, right? You want the Israelis and the Palestinians to stop killing each other. There is an obvious elephant in the room that cannot be ignored. What is that elephant in the room? Yes, the occupation, right? First of all, it's pretty obvious. Just end the occupation. Just end it and put an end to basically the occupation and basically dismantle the state of Israel. At least dismantle its constitution. Because as I've proven to you, Zionism is not native to the land. Zionism is a European ideology, right? Dismantle it and basically, let the people of Palestine choose their own path, right? Let them have their own sovereignty and decide their own destiny. And likewise, let the reasonable Israeli Jewish people take over. And I believe that you guys can actually have a happy future together. But first of all, the religious extremists on both sides have got to lose power. And the onus is on Israel in order to end the occupation, because without the end of the occupation, well, basically, Hamas will always have relevancy in the eyes of the Palestinians, right? Without the occupation, Hamas will basically become superfluous in the end, right? The Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir once said, "We can only begin to have peace with the Palestinians when they love their children more than they hate us." Do they really not love their children? Have you seen the anguished looks on the faces of parents in Gaza? The look of horror and despair at losing their children at such a tender age? Or do you think that every single Palestinian person would sacrifice their own children for the sake of a Judenrein Palestine? Because every single person in the world loves their children, right? Unless, of course, they're a psychopath. No parent in the world would ever sacrifice their own children for their own political objectives, even if, hypothetically, every single Palestinian wanted a Judenrein Palestine, which is not the case, right? But one thing you must ask is, does Israel really love its people? Does it? Because I know for a fact that the Hamas attack on that Israeli settlement could have been stopped, right? Israel has the best defenses and the best intelligence in the region, right? Surely they knew that Hamas was coming. But let me tell you why their guard was lowered that day. It is because they wanted justification in order to raze Gaza to the ground and create a Nakba or expulsion 2.0. They themselves told the Palestinians, the 1 million Palestinians in Gaza, get out of there. We're going to start razing the place to the ground, right? Because guess what? They want Gaza back. But they also need a moral justification to get it back. So that, because without that moral justification, the whole world will frown upon them storming into Gaza and carpet bombing the place, right? So what do? They allow 1,300 of their own people to serve as sacrificial lambs in order to justify their conquest into Gaza. Does Israel love its own people, or does it view its own people as dispensable pawns in the game of geopolitics? I put it to you. I leave it to you. But the most pressing issue really at this point is that, Israel is about to commit a genocide, right? And it is working round the clock with propagandists who go under the banner of liberal values like Bill Maher and Sam Harris in order to manufacture consent for that genocide. But history will not look kindly upon those of you who sided with the occupier. History will not look kindly upon those of you who stand by and watch as Israel begins an ethnic cleansing process in Gaza, right? Are you on the wrong side of history or the right side of history? There's a very easy way to tell in these next few weeks. Thank you.